Listen up, get ready, I'm not gonna take no more. There's a revolution, a revelation going on in my soul. Buckle up, get ready, we're not gonna sit.
It's an honor and a pleasure to bring on our next guest, the one and only Aaron Hughes of Warrior Writers and About Face. We go way back to the old days at the Heartland Cafe when he was involved with Iraq Veterans Against the War. And I just learned that he's involved with a group now called About Face Veterans Against the War. That organization, along with some others, including Chicago Jobs with Justice, the Workers' Rights Board, and the P.O. Box Collective, showed the film Sir, No Sir here in Rogers Park at the P.O. Box Collective. And I said, oh, let's talk about that. So that was this past week where the film is shown, but we're going to talk to Aaron now. So good day to you, Aaron.
Thank you, Michael. It's great to see you again. Thank you for having me on.
It's good to see you. Well, let's start off by talking just a little bit about that film and the history of GI resistance. You know, I remember back in the 60s, there were GI coffee houses near bases where fellows in the military who were not happy having been drafted, et cetera, would stand up to the war. And so I learned from our friend Peter Kuttner that there's a film that was being shown at P.O. Box Collective called Sir, No Sir. How about telling us a little bit about that film?
Well, it's a beautiful, powerful portrait of the GI movement during Vietnam, a movement that most people don't really know about. Even if people know about Vietnam Veterans Against the War, they might not know about all of the active duty organizing that was happening in the midst of the war. The number of the fact that there was over 300 new anti-war newspapers produced on active duty military bases around the world. The fact that there were a number of race riots, the number of people refusing to comply with their orders, the number of CO applicants, the number of direct forms of resistance, and the number of GIs that were just literally speaking out, not only against the war in Vietnam, but against their racism within the military. And, that's a legacy that is really important that people know about today. And that is a legacy that we in About Face Veterans Against the War are trying to build on and learn from. During the Iraq War and Afghanistan War, we set up coffee shops outside of Fort Hood, outside of Fort Drum, outside of Fort Joint Base Lewis McChord. We did GI outreach in that way. And here again, we're in this moment where people in the military are asking, is this what I signed up for? Why am I deploying to occupy my own community? Why am I deploying to Chicago? Why am I deploying to LA? And people are asking the same kind of questions about why they were contributing to genocide in Gaza and in Palestine. And these questions are inspiring a whole new generation of service members and veterans to speak out. And there's a legacy that they're a part of that Sir, No Sir really highlights. And that's something we want to connect these new, younger veterans to.
Well, let's talk about the new younger guys in the military, because I've been, on this show, I bring up the GI coffee houses. And, one of the things that was very distinctly different from now is our military was composed of mainly people who were drafted. And that's not, I don't think, do people still get draft cards? Do they have to register? And what's the difference now that you're seeing as an anti-war veteran with people who are now in the military? What do you sense is their stance on the militarization of our cities, our country, and around the world?
Yeah, our foreign policy. Yeah. Well, overwhelmingly, what I know is that the military and our foreign policy is rooted in the history of settler colonialism, is rooted within a strategy of counterinsurgency. And counterinsurgency depends on both targeting and recruiting the same communities. It has since the frontier wars to today. And so literally, people in these communities that are being targeted right now are also the ones that are being recruited into these systems of violence. And people in these communities, these service members are understanding that and trying to imagine ways to break that. And, we consider, you're right, there's not a draft, but we consider it a poverty draft. A lot of the people are looking for choices. Right now in colleges, the number one recruiting, the number one agency that's recruiting is ICE. ICE is out there recruiting. They're offering jobs. They're saying you can work from home and do security checks. You can make $60,000 a year starting off bat. And this kind of poverty draft of recruiting people into these forms of violence that are then targeting the own communities that people come from is what we're interested in breaking down. And I just want to note, like you brought up Vietnam and the draft, and as outlined in Soldiers in Revolt and by numerous of other accounts, overwhelming the soldiers that revolted and refused to participate and were involved with forms of resistance were not draftees. They were drafters. They were people that enlisted. And in fact, the individuals that enlisted spoke out a lot more than those that had been drafted into the military. And I think that that's like an important misnomer to kind of lift up, because I've heard that from organizers. A union organizer friend was like, yeah, well, it's not the same. People aren't going to resist in the military because there's not a draft. And that's not true. It wasn't true in Vietnam, and it's not true today. And that's why you have National Guard service members saying, no, we're not going to comply with these illegal, immoral, unjust orders. And they need to know that they're not alone. That is the work of the movement. That is the work of our movement, is to let them know that they're not alone and that they're a part of a legacy that's so outlined powerfully in Sir No Sir.
How far back does that legacy go? I imagine pretty far, because the U.S. has been involved in a lot of wars, many of them none of us even heard of, but they definitely have been active. How far back do you know about significant resistance to military operations by those within?
Since there have been standing militaries, there have been forms of resistance, and that has always been a case. And it's a case that has been suppressed and a story that is little told. And it's often, people that perhaps joined into those military efforts with idealistic reasons, and then realized that their ideologies and their ideas about, what they signed up for wasn't what they were doing. And that has always been the case, all the way since before the Revolutionary War against the British.
What about your own experience? You were in the military during the Iraq War, and I'm just wondering if did you go in? Were you drafted, or did you go in wanting to be in the military and then you changed? I know in my own personal experience, I had always wanted to be a Marine, and I signed up for the Platoon Leader Corps, which meant I would go after college for 2 years in the military as an officer. And luckily for me, a band of raggedy international hippies came through Lake Forest College talking about the San Francisco to Moscow Peace March. And they really turned me around. I'm wondering, what was your experience in turning you into an anti-war activist?
Yeah, I grew up here in Chicago and in the suburbs. I joined the Illinois Army National Guard right out of high school. Sergeant Love out of the Kedzie Armory came and picked me up in a red Camaro and took me to Burger King and talked to me about sandbagging the Mississippi River, which had flooded in the 90s. And I thought, oh, this is it. I want to help my community. I want to serve my country. I joined in 2000. I was a junior at the University of Illinois. I was going to school thanks to the support of the Illinois Army National Guard. And then, you know what? I got orders that took me right out of school and sent me to Kuwait. And I was deployed to Kuwait and Iraq. I did combat support missions, hauling supplies from the ports in Kuwait to different forward operating bases in Iraq for 15 months. And that was a radicalizing experience. I went over there thinking that, we could help build a democracy. I knew that there was never any weapons of mass destruction, but I still kind of believed we could build democracy. And it's so ironic to me now that I believe that, because militaries don't build democracies. People's movements, people build democracies. Occupations do not build democracies. That is a form of oppression and the opposite of democracy. And so, that kind of realization in the desert, sent me in kind of a moral crisis. A lot of what I had grown up with and believed in kind of crumbled in front of my face. And, I realized I didn't want to be a part of anything destructive anymore. I wanted to be a part of something creative. And I didn't know anything about activism or organizing, but I knew that, Picasso had painted the Guernica piece about the Spanish Civil War and had critiqued war and massacre. And, that was a history and a legacy I wanted to be a part of. So I went back and I studied art. And through that work of studying art, I started to learn about all this powerful work of veterans critiquing the wars they were in, from Otto Dix all the way up to the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. And in 2006, when Sir No Sir came out, a Vietnam Veteran Against the War member at Champaign-Urbana at the University of Illinois invited me out to go see the film. And at the time, I was doing my art and I was like, I got nothing else to say. Like, I'm nobody. I was nobody in the military. I was just a sergeant. I was a truck driver. I was nobody. And that film set me back. And it made me realize, no, it is all the people in the military, wherever you are, whether you're, a supply sergeant, whether you're a private that, stuck on some shit detail, it doesn't matter. Your story is the real story that needs to be told. And your story is not the story that is being put out, by the administration. And so that's how I got involved with Iraq Veterans Against the War. That's how I got involved with help organizing other veterans to speak out. And that's why I'm involved right now, trying to support National Guard service members to know that are questioning their orders, to know that they're not alone, that they have options and that they have rights. And, that there is a community here willing to support them, everything from the GI Rights Hotline to the Military Law Task Force through the National Lawyers Guild to About Face and our encrypted communication. We are here to support them.
Aaron Hughes, what's your sense of where guys in the military are at in general? Are they supportive of the administration? Is there a difference between officers and enlisted people? What's the racial makeup? Because I'm remembering back during the 1968 Democratic Convention, they sent troops from Fort Hood, Texas up here. And a number of black GIs refused to come. And I'm wondering if you're sensing any of that going on right now.
What I can say is that the military is disproportionately brown and black compared to the rest of our society. And it's disproportionately poor. And, there is a history of people in communities being recruited and targeted into reactionary politics. That has a long history. It's nothing new. But there's also a legacy and a history of people resisting. And that is, what I have so much hope for right now. There's not a lot to have hope around. Our city's under occupation, ICE raids every day. People are in the streets protesting every day. It is, we're in it. And, what gives me hope is the fact that the oligarchy, these political elites, they still depend on service members complying. And you know what? I believe that service members are going to make the right choice. They're going to choose people over their orders. And I believe that was true in Vietnam. And I believe that's going to be true today. And that's why we're doing this work. And every one service member, military member that withdraws their consent for these orders, it's it's not only literally taking the gears out of the machine of the violence, but it's also a force multiplier. It is just amplifying every aspect of the movement against these forms of violence in our communities and around the world. And that is why I have so much hope in this moment. And if I can, I know yeah. I just want to mention, like we've been doing so much work with the unions here in Chicago. Most people don't know that the largest union busting basically in US history has happened at the VA, and basically revoking all of the VA workers' federal union bargaining rights. And we've been out there with National Nurses United, with AFGE, with SEIU Healthcare, all the time demonstrating, demanding these rights of these union workers. And we've been honored to get to continue to partner with them and fight and build a coalition through the May Day Strong Coalition. And now, this action that we are now organizing for Veterans Day is national. I was on a call last night where over 5,000 veterans and union members registered to attend, and 1,000 people, 1,300 actually, joined. And, around the simple thing of vets say no to ICE, we say no to occupation, and we say no to cuts. And, that is like very simple organizing that we're bringing people out together around, and we're trying to mobilize around Veterans Day. There's going to be town halls, but here in Chicago, we'll, based on the legacy of Vietnam Veterans Against the War, we will be down at the Vietnam Memorial at 11 o'clock on the 11th. And we are going to have a rally, and we're going to have a memorial, a ceremony, and then we're going to march from the Vietnam Veterans Memorial down to Federal Plaza to let the feds know that we are saying no to ICE, we are saying no to the cuts, and we are saying no to Occupy.
Let me ask about Veterans Day. You said the 11th. What month is that?
That's November 11th.
November. And where is that, in DC or here in Chicago?
That's right. Well, there's going to be actions around around the country. I encourage people to get involved through the May Day Strong Coalition, whether you're a part of a union, a church group, a community group, or a veterans group. We want to come together and be involved in mobilizing and saying no to ICE, no to these cuts, and no to occupation. And, we will be at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial here in Chicago. And that is where where Vietnam Veterans Against the War has rallied on Memorial Day and Veterans Day at 11 o'clock for over 30 years. And my first time I ever spoke out was at that rally in 2006, when Vietnam Veterans Against the War asked me, hey, will you come up to our rally from Champaign and speak? And I was humbled and honored to be a part of that. And then realized, it's not only am I connected with all these other anti-war veterans of my generation, but I'm connected to all of these older veterans and this legacy of work. And right now, I think there's a lot of people that feel pretty lost. And being able to root in this anti-war veteran history has been really grounding for me. And it's been a way for me to find a way home. Just like I said, I was lost in the desert, and I didn't know, I didn't know anything about anything. And these Vietnam Veterans Against the War, they connected me to my own history.
Aaron, how did About Face come about, and what does it actually mean?
Yeah, so About Face, Veterans Against the War, full name, is Iraq Veterans Against the War. Iraq Veterans Against the War for a long time had expanded beyond just Iraq veterans. We had people that were doing combat support and running drones operations that were stateside and never left the States, but they were running drones in Iraq, Afghanistan, throughout the Horn of Africa. And, we had members that were deployed in Afghanistan. And so we were looking for ways of expanding our name and our mission. And so About Face, Veterans Against the War, is where we came from, or what we came to. And, About Face is a military maneuver. It is a part of drilling. It is literally turning around. And for me, this turn is fundamental. It is, this turning from militarism to solidarity. It's fundamental, and it's so important that veterans know that they can be a part of that, and fighting for our community is for real.
Aaron, there's a lot more we could talk about. We got a few minutes left. You are, you're like not only an activist and an organizer, you're a teacher, you're an Iraq war veteran, and you're an artist. And I really like art that has some message a little bit, and I assume yours does. Talk a little bit about your art, and I know you have an exhibit down in Springfield. Share a little info on that.
Yeah, I'm really honored that the University of Illinois Springfield invited me down for an exhibition. And last year, my good dear friend and mentor, Barry Romo, a longtime leader with Vietnam Veterans Against the War, passed away. And when he passed away, I ended up inheriting a large amount of his movement ephemera, his materials. And I've been going through those and looking at those old Winter Soldier newspapers that Vietnam Veterans Against the War used to publish with their beautiful illustrations by Carol Fisher. And, I asked myself, what does it mean to center that history and that legacy? And, that is a big part of, what that exhibition is about. It's about centering an anti-war veteran history. And, a featured piece in that exhibition is called Fort Hood 43, based off of the Black soldiers at Fort Hood who refused to deploy to the DNC in 1968. The number of movement organizations like the Black Panthers that came out to support them, their legacy needs to be told and uplifted. And so rooting in these histories of anti-war veteran activism and resistance, I'm trying to create a cultural kind of response and put it out there. And so that piece is literally made together of stitched together military uniforms and then collaged movement papers, GI movement papers. And then it's painted with an image of the Fort Hood 43, and it's painted pink because pink is this, back to this about face, it is literally the opposite of green. And, in the military, in the Army, you're Army green. It's literally this turn from this drab green to this bright pink. And that is something I want to continually push and represent and invite other veterans into so then they know they're a part of this important, powerful legacy.
This is wonderful talking to you. I'm going to ask one more question. Has there been any defection among ICE people that you know about? These guys are just vicious and cruel out there. Under that leadership is a little bit that way, and I'm just wondering, has there been any turning around? Do you know of any ICE people who have said, "I'm not going to do this"?
I haven't heard of that yet.
Yeah,
but these experiences are going to live with them for the rest of their lives. It is going to be in their dreams and in their nightmares and what keeps them up at night. And, what makes it hard for them to adapt to having any kind of other form of life. And I know that these things stick with you. I was involved with an occupation. I pointed my weapon at families and communities, and I know how wrong it was and how I still hold that guilt. And, I know what is happening right now is not sustainable. And I know that they depend on people complying, and people aren't going to keep complying with this. And I've seen it. We've seen not only the National Guard members start to speak out, but we've also seen even state police, start to question, like, what is their role? And straight up Chicago police, Chicago police have a legacy of brutality and torture. And in this moment, some of them are asking what they're doing. And to me, asking that question is the first step. It's the first kind of thing that begins the turn. And we have a job in the movement to create as much space to support them in making that turn. That's a big part of what we're trying to do. And it's not a job for everybody. I know that. I know that, doing outreach to people within the security state is not for everyone. And it is a problematic role. We are a contradiction. But Vietnam Veterans Against the War to about-face Veterans Against the War, we are a living contradiction. But we also are part of an important legacy of transformation. And if we can turn, it gives us all a way and a model of how we can all turn away from these systems of violence.
Well, we're rooting for you. You keep up the good work, and I'm going to see you at that march on November 11th at the Vietnam Memorial downtown Chicago. It's great talking.